Hello and welcome to the Scuttlebutt podcast. This podcast is an exploration of life and business from a veteran perspective. I'm your host, Brock Briggs, and each week I bring you a conversation with a service member or vet at the top of their craft to discuss their unique knowledge. Today I'm speaking with Troy Peterson. Troy was a PsyOps officer in the Army and is now working on product policy and trust and safety at OpenAI. In this conversation, we talk about the value of information and how the control of access to information can be used as a weapon. Troy shares a story of providing radios to locals in Afghanistan in an attempt to build trust and encourage participation in elections and government activity. We talk about how we see access to information play out in our world today, particularly in social media, the news, and the rise of individual influence over large populations. And we also talk about how to optimize for learning and growth, not always money. After some time spent aligning his personal interests with careers, Troy landed a job at Facebook, which has helped him propel through several tech jobs and kept him from being forced to make decisions he didn't want to. He gives a few lessons on how to approach your finances and career that keep you from being backed into a corner. You can find this episode as well as all other episodes, the video on YouTube, transcripts, and written content to keep learning, all at scuttlebuttpodcast.co. Please enjoy this episode with Troy Peterson. We're going to talk about your resume and kind of the different jobs that you've had. I'm curious, you've worked at several relatively high profile places, I'll call them, or names or companies that people have heard of. Do you get like the new job jitters at all? Is that still a thing that you kind of experience?
Oh, totally. I think, especially if you're going into any sort of, new role or new company, definitely experience some imposter syndrome, some kind of, oh gosh, am I gonna be good enough for this? Am I gonna be able to do the things? Am I doing the right things? Am I learning and meeting the right people and showing impact quickly? I think fortunately, jobs or most good companies and good leaders will anticipate that and help you construct a good roadmap to make sure that you're spinning up and learning quickly and getting from crawl, walk, run, and then being off to the races. Trying not to be too concerned about it, but yeah, just also really enjoying having some new subject matter to dig into and kind of meeting new folks and starting a fresh start. I feel like in the military, they throw you into a new job a lot. I think the longest I was in any one gig was about a year a lot of the times as an officer. And so it's, hey, just as soon as you're getting your feet under you, it's, oh, go do something different. And it's nice here to be like, okay, I'm going to be able to utilize this and don't necessarily have to just expect to get unplugged really quickly.
That was one thing that routinely surprised me about the military is the level of preparedness that they expect when you actually show up was far below what I thought it would be. And you've got a much different training pipeline and background than I have. So that may contribute to a little bit of differences there. But going through the schools that I did and then showing up to my commands, I was like so eager and worried that, man, what happens if I just don't know this one specific thing? But then once I got there, I realized like the average knowledge level and capacity was so much lower than I thought. And they really are expecting you to just kind of be handheld really from day one. They're not going to ask you to do something, even in a schooly environment, that you're not capable of doing.
Yeah. And I think there's a balance that healthy organizations strike of being like, hey, we're going to introduce some stress. We're going to expect you to grow and be challenged, but we're also going to not throw you into the deep end with the sharks and without floaties and then just watch you get eaten alive, because that's not good for them and not good for you.
I'm gonna get like your high level background here in just a moment, but was that your experience in the training pipeline that you went through? And maybe could you speak to some of the challenges presented in those training environments that were or weren't as difficult maybe as you thought they might be?
Yeah, coming up through West Point and then going through infantry officer training and ranger school and then going off to an operational unit and prepping to deploy and then going to like special operations and going through that whole pipeline and prepping to do deployments there. They do the best they can in terms of introducing the right amounts of stress and giving you the foundational or doctrinal materials to get you ready. But I think there's also, for at least folks like me, a healthy amount of kind of anxiety and self-imposed stress about showing up and being ready. There's an immense amount of, I think, buildup that happens around making sure that you are ready as a junior officer to be a platoon leader and be responsible for the lives of soldiers and make the mission happen, but also look out for your guys. There were some things that you were like, okay, yep, I'm now going to plan and conduct a foot patrol in Afghanistan. I have gotten a lot of prep for this, but then there's also other things like, oh gosh, I'm having to like help out a soldier who's in financial troubles or who's having family issues or other lifestyle issues. And it's just like, wait a minute, I'm like a 23-year-old. Am I actually equipped to help anyone with this, let alone be responsible for it and expected to like know how to do it? So I don't know. I think some folks can be like, oh gosh, I have to act and pretend like I know everything. But the best examples that I had and something that I tried to carry with me and bring to this point in my life is being like self-aware enough to know when to ask for help, or being not trying not to be too afraid to say, I don't actually know everything. I need to go find new information or get other things. Because if we all waited until we were totally ready for something, then we would never actually get started, which I imagine you've learned with podcast and doing all of these things, right?
Oh, most certainly. You really hit the nail on the head with that. It is a really delicate balance between ensuring that you're listening properly and like actually retaining and understanding the material, and then also knowing when to ask those questions, because you almost always, and especially in the training environments the military brings on, is you always think that you're the only one who doesn't understand. But a lot of times there are things that are just, it's not being talked about, or maybe you missed something that like you weren't there for to hear, which is critical to the success of the evolution, whatever that may be. So kind of sucking up your pride and being afraid to look dumb, that's you end up getting rewarded, and you
Yeah.
never really look dumb, actually.
It's better to like raise your hand and be like, hold up, I need to ask a dumb question sooner rather than later, because the longer you pretend like you know what's going on, the worse it's going to be, or the bigger the kind of fall might be. If you're like, oh wait, then people are like, wait, you've been doing this for 3 months, why didn't you ask this on the first week? Bad news doesn't get better with time, so might as well ask those questions early and then make sure you try not to forget.
I really like that phrase. That's a good one and accurately describes something that more people should be embodying. Why don't you take 2 to 3 minutes here and give me a high level overview of what lands you sitting here in front of me today?
Yeah, I guess starting from the beginning, grew up in the Pacific Northwest, mostly kind of Portland and Seattle. I was in high school when 9/11 happened and was already interested in the military, but didn't have any family connection. When 9/11 happened, that kind of really crystallized my focus on finding a way that I wanted to join and serve. The dean of students at my high school was a West Point grad. I was pretty interested in the Army, and bad eyesight had already disqualified me from likely being able to become a pilot, which was like my first interest when I was a little kid. So then as I started to learn more and more, I was like, interested in going to college, was learning about ROTC and the academy options, ended up getting into the academy and decided that was an opportunity worth trying. Went off there, spent 4 years at West Point as a history major and a systems engineering like minor, and then decided to become an infantry officer. So commissioned in 2008, went down to Fort Benning, did all of my kind of like infantry training, ranger school and stuff. Went off and joined my first infantry unit in Germany, where we were prepping to deploy to Afghanistan. I was in Afghanistan from 2010 to 11 and commanded a combat outpost for part of my deployment there. Then came back, decided to pursue one of the special operations pipelines. So went to selection, got selected, and volunteered to go become a psychological operations officer. Went off to the PSYOP training pipeline, did that for, it was a year and a half at Fort Bragg, and then was a PSYOP officer for about 4 years after that. Then decided after a few more shorter soft deployments, was ready to hang it up from active duty, decided to get out. And after investigating my options, I had the GI Bill, so decided to go to grad school. I'd seen some friends and peers go get MBAs and thought that might be a good kind of broadening opportunity. Was fortunate enough to get into a pretty attractive program. Went to Harvard for my MBA, and then showed up with my hypothesis of like, all right, after school, I want to go work in tech. And so then work to make that happen. And then for the last 5 years, I've been working in tech. Spent a couple of years at Facebook after I graduated from business school. Then went over to Stripe for a couple of years working in fintech. And here just a couple of months ago, joined OpenAI. And so now I'm working in product policy there. Does that work?
That works pretty well. That's a pretty good 2 to 3 minute overview, I would say, or maybe one of the more timely of the ones I've asked for. One thing that was so funny about looking through your background, and I texted you this the other day asking you, is like, why haven't you started a company yet? Because this is like the exact resume of every kind of successful startup person that I've ended up seeing. A lot of failed ones as well, but this is like a very similar resume to going off and starting your own thing. What are your thoughts about that in general? And that's not really pertinent to our conversation probably for today, but what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I certainly haven't ruled it out. When I was leaving active duty, part of my kind of like transition hypothesis, like I call it, was I think I want to go work in smaller companies and do startup-y stuff. But that I was also concerned, and I had some mentors who told me, like, hey, a lot of people think they want that because it seems sexy and cool, and maybe you can get really rich if you get lucky. But like the best advice I got was, hey, go cut your teeth, get some on the job learning in big tech, get that brand on your resume so that you're a bit more of a known quantity, because it can get even harder. It can be even harder to get an opportunity at a startup than it can even at a large company, especially as a veteran without a clear background in it. I've been working my way down to smaller and smaller companies as I've been working through my time in the private sector. And yeah, I think it could be really interesting, but I'm fully aware that there are some challenges and different kind of lifestyle requirements when you are running your own thing and trying to build it up versus being able to unplug from work or take time when you want it versus having to constantly be the guy on the phone for fires and emergencies.
You're definitely not going to take 5 to 6 months off to go skiing
You can say
when
that
you're
again.
running your own operation. That's for
No
sure.
joke.
One of the things that you told me that kind of precludes you coming up into these roles, I think, is you said that you had an early interest in tech. You said you grew up in the Pacific Northwest, Seattle, very infamous for kind of a West Coast hub of tech, I guess, at least with Microsoft and maybe some other companies there. Was Talk to me about that early interest there, and then maybe what seeds your interest in going into the psychological sector while you were in the army.
Yeah. So, like you said, growing up in Seattle in the 90s wasn't quite like Silicon Valley levels of everything is tech, but with Microsoft being big already and then Amazon and some other kind of startups like Real Networks becoming big out of the Seattle area, I think it was more just around me to be absorbed than it would be if I'd been living in other parts of the country. My dad growing up was in marketing, was his like function while he was in the private sector. And I also just had a natural inclination towards advertising and that kind of stuff. I enjoyed watching TV commercials as much as actual shows. And those two things together, I think, made me inclined to just start tinkering. And I think my family was also pretty supportive. I got to like mess around with old cameras, old computer components, old cars, and I just really enjoyed trying to either take them apart, see how they worked, or fix them. And that kind of tinkerer nature, even though I like didn't become like an engineer in undergrad, that disposition stuck with me. And I always was interested, even once I was in uniform, of finding ways to either use technology or use systems engineering to try to improve what it was that we were doing, which as then started manifesting more and more through my time in the military. And then I think really stoked my interest in returning to tech for my civilian career, as opposed to some of the other more, I think, super well worn paths that some vets might find after they leave active duty.
We're going to get into the overlap of your time learning in like the psychological community in the army and then what that means for your careers after post army. One of the things that you also told me is about when you were pursuing the psychological, I'm going to probably butcher this name several
You can
times
just
here,
call it
but
psyop.
psyop sector, that you were like almost tried to be talked out of it. And I guess what was your reasoning or rationale for wanting to pursue that? Was it because of your background? And then what were those conversations like trying to talk you out of it? Because I'm guessing at this point you probably didn't know you were going to be getting out yet.
Yeah, I was when I was first going to West Point, and then when I was a junior officer, I was like very seriously considering sticking around for a full career. I was never really concerned with trying to become like a big general or something, but I thought, hey, as long as this is rewarding and meaningful and works for kind of me and my eventual family, then I won't withhold judgment on that front. I really enjoyed a lot of my time in the infantry. It was fun being out there with soldiers, prepping for deployment, doing hard things, then going and deploying and getting to do them in dangerous situations. And I certainly, especially as a young infantry officer, in the back of my head was like, I either want to go to Ranger Regiment or want to go to Special Forces and do that kind of stuff. That was always the cool guy version of climbing the ladder and going off there and doing special or difficult things with small teams. That was always like more appealing to me than being like, oh, I want to be like a colonel, brigade commander who's in charge of 5,000 people or something. But yeah, the detour to psychological operations didn't really start to crystallize for me until I was in Afghanistan. And the first part of my deployment there, I was commanding a remote combat outpost, could only be reached by helicopter, not far from the Arghandab River. And it was like just being time traveled back to, if not the Stone Age, then certainly the 1800s or the early 1900s in a very rural area. There was really just no information ecosystem beyond word of mouth to speak of. There was no cell service, no television, really no electricity, even in the villages around my outpost, other than maybe a local generator. And so everything was just being brought back and passed word of mouth, or if you were the Taliban, via night letters and actions. And in that environment, it was really easy for the Taliban to spread rumors or try to like convince the people through misinformation that the Americans can't be trusted. They are scary, different people, not like us. To the point that I think the anecdote I told you last time we chatted was like, we always wore like eye protection, sometimes sunglasses, sometimes clear lenses, went out on patrol in case anything from a bomb to getting sand in your eye. But the Taliban would tell some of the local villagers, oh, those are basically like x-ray glasses and they can see under your clothes. And so everyone, basically a lot of people would be afraid to like be around us or come talk to us or let us come talk to them. So I'd be out on foot patrols daily. And I realized over time that if I would just take off my sunglasses and hold them up so that the kids in the villages could look through them, they'd be like, oh, wow, this is funny. Similar thing with cameras. Like there was some superstition in some places that if you have your picture taken, it could be either a violation of a tenet of Islam or it could do something bad to your soul. But so a lot of times like people might just hold out their camera and try to like snap shots, but I would take the time to show kids the back of my little like pocket digital camera, and then just like kids anywhere, they would want to start making faces and seeing the funny stuff. And it was just a way to break down some of the barriers and build rapport. But that is not scalable when you have to be out walking on patrol trying to like interact with everyone person by person. The road to PSYOP was like we randomly got dropped off in a helicopter cargo delivery, a Connex insert with this thing I learned was called like a radio in a box. It was like a prefab localized radio station that we could set up. And so I had my radio operator and me set up this computer and this broadcast system. We were like, oh, we can start putting stuff out. And then we got a bunch of wind up radios that we could hand out on patrols. And there was a hunger in these local communities to understand what was going on, to know what might be obtained via government support and economic stimulus in this very like poor agricultural area. So like attendance to the like local political gatherings, the shuras, would be quite strong when we had me or the district mayor, district governor come out to talk to people. But like the amount of labor involved in even just letting people know that we were going to have one of these shuras like once a month was colossal. You'd have to go do multiple patrols, stop in many villages and hamlets and try to tell everyone to be like, this day, this time, come over here. And at first it was like, man, if we can just reduce the friction of getting some of the like simple desired information to these people, we could really start to snowball the progress and accessibility to the population. So we set up this radio, started mostly just playing like pre-recorded Islamic music that was given to us on the hard drive, but started periodically interspersing a message when we were going to have a shura or about the upcoming elections, and just then taking feedback from the locals. And once it became known in the Valley that like, hey, if you talk to the Americans while they're out on patrol, or if you talk to the Afghan army while they're coming through, you may get a wind-up radio, and then you'll be able to hear all these broadcasts that can be really compelling and interesting. And so it really helped us invert the dynamic of this valley to being very standoffish and wanting to avoid the Americans because you don't know if you're going to get shot or anything else, to being like, oh man, they are demonstrating through actions and through words that they're actually doing work to be here and help us. So that really started that interest, and that planted the seed for me of, wow, this did so much more, and it really enabled us to do a lot in a few months that would have been essentially impossible given where we were, and if we were just like trying to do it the old-fashioned way, word of mouth. And so that kind of that seed of technology being able to amplify the ability to communicate and generate effects. I was just like, whoa, that's really high leverage. And that's something that would be really interesting. And I think that's what the PSYOP kind of specialty is supposed to do. And so I was like, oh, I want to chase that. I don't think I've quite gotten to your question about the mentorship and the dissuasion, but I'll pause there because I feel like I've been telling the story for a minute.
No, that's good. Was the lack of understanding about the people that you were interacting with about, like you talked about your glasses or the camera, is it just that they are so remote and off grid that they just have never seen or interacted with that? Is that the driver of
That was
that?
a lot of it. Yeah. There were times we walked into villages that literally thought that we were Russian soldiers. And this was in 2010. And it was just like, there is so much I need to tell you that I can't about what's been happening really in the last like 30 years since the Russians left, but also in the last almost 10 years once I was there that Americans had ostensibly been in parts of the country. But this was still more towards the beginning of the surge in Afghanistan. And there hadn't been nearly as large of an American footprint, especially in really remote parts of the country, to where they would have had any of that interaction. They might see some helicopters flying around in a place where there's very low literacy, really no technology or information technology penetration, and people are living essentially subsistence farming lives. Then it's easy to not know a bigger picture there. And I draw the equivalent a lot because a lot of where this place was reminded me of rural Washington, where my mom grew up and where my family was, and I spent some of my childhood, like being like, oh yeah, okay, very agricultural. They're moving with the seasons. They're focused on their crops and hopefully being able to like make a slightly better life for their family. But everything else is secondary to that if you don't have some of those like basic fundamentals of life. And so I think some of that perspective was very helpful for me of understanding what needed to be done differently versus, oh, we're just going to get out there. We're just going to patrol. We're just going to go kick doors and try to find the Taliban and kill them and not mess around with all this annoying, messy civic governance development kind of thing.
No, exactly. And I think that's one of the things that is most understood about this war and the Middle East, just writ large, is it's not exactly the way that the news portrays of just like, we're not on this witch hunt for the Taliban. We are, but there's a much bigger picture that we're there to instill. And this may be a little bit idealistic of replicating democracy overseas, which is proven to really not work that well. But your story here really highlights the power of information and communication. And it's so intriguing to me that the Taliban find it worthwhile to essentially fleece these people who don't know any better to tell them about how bad that the Americans are. These are people, farmers living just in these remote areas. They seem to get some value from that. And a lot of your guys' responsibility in that case is trying to spur involvement in government and voting and elections and things that were previously deemed unsafe
Mhm.
to participate in that.
Yeah.
And that's such a far cry from the stuff that you see on television. It's
Yeah.
just people kicking in doors and shooting, and it's not just people lining up and just shooting at each other.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. There were periodic firefights or IED explosions and stuff. And that also, when the Taliban's actions killed local civilians, that also had a big effect on their willingness to work with us because they saw us come out of our little outpost and try to save people's lives. And then we medevac the civilians that had been blown up by an IED. And that also, again, actions in addition to words, I think will help turn people around. And that really helped us make a lot of progress while being like, hey, we're here to try and protect you. Of course, we want to keep the Taliban away. But then there was also a dynamic, kind of like what you said, of fleecing the locals, where, all right, so our base got put out at the very far end of any kind of semblance of government patrol. There were valleys that I knew that I could see basically from the outpost that had never seen American soldiers like at all. It was just like, hey, maybe some special forces team went there 5 years ago one night and that was it. And yeah, you want to talk about going even farther back in time, that could be it. But the Taliban basically seeded enough IEDs in kind of the area around this outpost just to cut off any road transit. And so then they basically made it known of, hey, you can't go back all the way back to the district or the provincial capital on this road that the Americans have built because you might die and it's too dangerous. But you can go through this alternate dirt road that we have kept open through a different valley, and you will be attacked by the Taliban, and you might be interrogated or abused if they think that you're working with the Americans or something. But it was this combination of preserving the transit that they needed, because we were a transit zone for a lot of the fighters coming from Pakistan or up north down into Kandahar province and going really down in Helmand and down into kind of the heartland where a lot of the like real fighting was going. So they like less wanted to just attack the Americans than the local gangs really just wanted to like extract value and basically do like illicit checkpoints and steal money from the locals, and then preserve their ability to move fighters down to some of the real high intensity conflict areas where there was a lot more fighting going on. And the only times that they would really try to get at us either with ambushes or IEDs was when we were trying to like push out beyond the box that they wanted to keep us in right around the base. And so it was this cat and mouse game, not just of physical effects or attacks, but also of information and economic dynamics, that it was fascinating to see, but also really difficult. One other, I won't rabbit hole too much on the war stories, but like one other dynamic was we had some economic development, an agricultural development group that was like Arkansas National Guard guys who were all like farmers in their real life, who came out and they basically got some funds to get hand tools and like really like human powered farming equipment, fertilizer, shovels, all these kinds of things. And so we had the district center right next to the outpost. We put out on the radios and told people on patrols like, hey, we're going to have basically like an agricultural development seminar where, the people who come can get some of these free tools. And basically this helps show that the Afghan government is working for y'all. The Taliban is trying to steal your money when you take your crops to market. We're trying to help you grow more crops, making that difference really stark. And that was the biggest attack. We had an attack the night before this conference on the cops or on the outpost from 3 directions for 3 straight hours. And every time air support would come on station, it would all stop. And every time air support left to go to some other firefight, kick back up again, and nearly had the perimeter of the outpost breached, where it's just like, wow, the Taliban really doesn't want this clear economic opportunity to be presented to the village people. And so then the next morning it was like, hey, we're going to sleep for a couple hours, keep folks on watch in case they kick up an attack again. But now we're going to go out and foot patrol and try to make the valley as safe as possible so people could actually come to the district center and go through the seminar where they're learning new stuff and getting these tools. The Taliban attacked us more over that particular event than they even did over the elections, which was really stark of, hey, if the village people and the civilians start getting out from under our thumb, they might start really skewing more towards being willing to work with or support the government. And that was really what they wanted to prevent.
Hearing that story reminds me, a couple episodes ago, I chatted with Jeremy McCool, the wireless electric vehicle charging company Hevo founder. And one of the things he was talking about while he spent some time over there is how there was like damage to the electrical grid, and they like got all these diesel generators fired up and basically restored power to the village. And then that actually brought on more attacks because of the fact that they're getting subsistence. And it really gives credence to this different type of fight. It's not that they're necessarily there to kill Iraqis or Afghanis or wherever. It's not that. It is they're trying to keep them from having access to resources and maybe posing a further threat to them.
Yeah. And so to maybe meander back to the question you asked a while ago, I thought that was like a really powerful experience for me. My partner at the time had been in the Peace Corps. So I was learning a lot of this stuff about like economic development, governance development, as well as, hey, we're going to go close with and destroy the enemy when we can. But then I was just like, okay, like this kind of really lit my fire in a way that, that I was like, this is what I need to go chase. This is like very strong intuition here. That's meaningful. And I'd already been aware of the existence of kind of the other aspects of special operations, whether civil affairs or PSYOP, in addition in the Army to the Rangers, the Special Forces, the aviators. And so as I started digging more into it, I was like, hey, I want to go do this PSYOP thing. That seems really interesting. And at the time, I knew that if I stayed in the infantry, I probably wasn't going to get to deploy again, especially as like a company commander, because I'd have to like go back to the schoolhouse, go back to an operational unit, wait for deployment. And it was obvious kind of by 2012 when I was having to make this decision that the deployment cycle for conventional like infantry units was like winding down pretty quickly. If you went back to Afghanistan as an infantry guy, there was a much lower chance than in 2010 or so that you were going to really be out shooting and moving and doing that kind of work. So that really crystallized it for me. But I had some mentors. I had phenomenal leadership and mentorship as a young officer. And my kind of the colonels that I worked for, the majors and captains and stuff were like, hey man, PSYOP's really weird. And that is not likely a route to a successful career. You have a lot of potential here in the infantry. We can help you out, do that stuff. And I seriously considered it because I didn't want to make like a career limiting decision or blindly. I wanted to like really try to understand what the options were. But at the end of the day, after like weighing the options, I was like, all right, I can try out for the Rangers, I can try out for Special Forces, or I can do this weird thing that feels like it actually really suits me. And after like weighing the options and all that advice, I was like, I think I still need to go try this weird thing and preserve the relationships. I didn't blow them off, but I said, hey, I appreciate it. And one of the things that kind of indicated how much they actually cared about me was they were like, okay, hey, we've given you the best advice we can, but we would rather you go do the thing that you want in the Army than leave the Army because we're not like supporting you, which is a lot, I think, better support and leadership than a lot of folks get from commands that they're a part of. So luckily they didn't try to fight me on changing branches. And so then I went off to the kind of captain's career course and then off up to a PSYOP training pipeline up at Fort Bragg.
A couple interesting words I wanted to highlight that you use in our warm up for this discussion. You called our war in Afghanistan like an information fight and called going into PSYOP strategic leverage, or like the power to influence and communicate with populations. That kind of feeds my big question to you would be, is that was our war in Afghanistan representative of why that power of communication is important?
I think it certainly can be both in the positive and in the negative case. I think there were plenty of times where, for better or worse, units were too conventionally or too kinetically focused on just, hey, we do want to do that, go kick doors, find the bad guys, shoot him in the face kind of stuff. And there were certainly some success stories within the country or within the long history of the war of places that were able to get better, get more services, have positive development for the civilians, or be less of a sanctuary to the Taliban or insurgent forces. Given what I told you about like my upbringing and childhood, I think we got to take it with a grain of salt that like maybe I was predisposed or biased to find the information like perspective here, and then look for a way to apply that interest of my own. But at the same time, there is the potential for strategic leverage in effective communications with people. That doesn't mean that it's always realized. It doesn't mean that we're always either allowed to do it, or even when we are within the influence professional community, that that it goes well even when we're allowed to. There's plenty of examples of like bad leaflets or bad messages that went out and had a ton of blowback, which is sometimes why there's a lot more constraint or a lot more limitations placed on that kind of operation than there is on dropping bombs and firing missiles and firing bullets. At its best, it can be the aspiration is really for an effective kind of psychological operation mission to really support and be like a force multiplier for the larger mission of the military, which isn't just I would argue, is to fight and win the nation's wars, but is also to shape conditions before a war actually breaks out so that you maybe don't have to fight and don't have to put as many young people into harm's way and spend so much blood and treasure on what for our generation have been really long conflicts.
Yeah, that ounce of prevention prevents a pound of cure, or whatever the
Yeah,
phrase goes a really long way. I thought it
amen.
was interesting that you had told me that it required actually a higher level of approval to broadcast different information over like one of these radio programs than it does to like launch an airstrike against a target. That literally blew my mind.
Yeah, that got a lot of attention, I think, later on in the fight against ISIS, but that was definitely a factor in certain places. Like when I was going through PSYOP training, when I was telling that story about, hey, this is just what we did with a random radio in Afghanistan, and it really generated effects. And some of my instructors were like, oh my gosh, that was such a huge violation. You were not allowed to do that by the regulations. And I was just like, it worked, man. Like it was combat. Like we're figuring shit out and just trying to make it go. But it's also just indicative, I think, of in general the difference between, say, like a peacetime or a garrison military mindset where it's, hey, we have to be very controlled, very top down, versus combat, which is like the most brutal learning environment imaginable. And it's, look, man, I got it. We have rules for a reason, fully agree, but I'm also trying to keep my guys alive and accomplish my mission. And sometimes the top-down method isn't the best way to do that. And that was also kind of part of the appeal to me of the kind of special operations community, and then later on the tech world, where it's, hey man, like there isn't a solution, we've got a really tough problem, we're just going to throw some brain power at it and see what sticks.
I want to have you Monday morning quarterback here for a second, and just looking back on your time in and implementing some of the things that we're talking about. Speak to the effectiveness of the kicking indoors route that you obviously did versus the more communication focused objectives, where it's you're spurring people to get involved in the community, the government, elections, all of that, versus more of the violent approach. Do you have any feelings about whether or not one was more effective than the other?
I don't know that I can totally disentangle them, because I think, like, there's a saying in the infantry, fire without maneuver is just a waste of bullets. You can use, yeah, if you just shoot stuff but you aren't actually going and taking the position from the enemy, then there's no point. And maneuvering without fire is a suicide mission. You need you need both of those things to work together effectively to have a hope, especially in a counterinsurgency environment, of longer term success. Because it's real easy to only focus on, hey, figure out where bad guys are, go shoot bad guys, and then come home, hoist the flag and call it good. But like, when you have a place like, particularly really either Afghanistan or Iraq, we're not isolated geographically from external bases of support, whether Pakistan, Iran, other border countries and areas, as well as portions of the local population that were either because they were just fence sitters trying not to get caught in the crossfire, or because they disliked the external incoming force being in their homeland, were willing to be areas of support for an insurgent force. And then a lot of the insurgent groups have, to a certain degree, I think what you have to mathematically consider a somewhat infinite supply of bodies to put into the fight. Guess what? They're raising and training a lot of disadvantaged or disillusioned young men who are willing to go prove themselves in battle. That's not limited to them. We all have that inclination, which is why we volunteer and sign up to go do something weird and dangerous. But at the end of the day, I think there are people, especially given the mission that we were trying to accomplish in, say, Afghanistan, there are people and places that need to just go be focused on kinetically, and you can keep the information or that communication effort in a very compelling and impactful shaping or supporting operation. And then there are other times where, I think that the just the presence or the threat offered by the military can be capitalized in other scenarios where you have kind of information or communication work in the lead and really shaping or preventing the need to then go do the thing. But I don't think we can fully treat them as one or other in the vacuum, as much as I would love to see more resources and focus put on effective mitigation of conflict, as opposed to just, oh, great, now it's time to drop bombs and light stuff on fire.
I appreciate you taking my very short-sighted question and turning it
No,
into
no, you're
something
good.
intelligent. That's probably the much more depict way to describe that situation. And I like that I like the analogy of the fire and maneuvering thing. You need both. You
Mhm.
need to be able to pursue an information edge, but also be willing to, what is it? FDR's speak softly, carry a big stick thing.
Exactly.
Got to be willing to back it up, make sure that they're not empty words.
Yeah. My impolitic way of saying it is, like, there are some people that, can't be communicated with. And if they're if they're a threat to, say, my soldiers, or they're a threat to Americans in the homeland, they probably just need to be shot in the face or hit with a hellfire. But I think we could stand to do a whole lot less of that if we got better at the communications and consistency of American values and the value proposition of a liberal democratic way of life, at least for ourselves and internationally, and being consistent about that over the long term.
Over the last couple days, thinking about coming into this interview, I've been thinking a lot about the value of information. And you don't need to look very far in our culture, like American culture today, to see why it's so important to people. I made a list here, just a quick Google search of looking at billionaires that have basically bought distribution outlets through the news. And this is not exactly the same thing, but the distribution of news and what is said. We've got the Washington Post, Boston Globe, Star Tribune, LA Times, the Atlantic Time, Fortune, Elon buying Twitter recently. Like all of those are major news outlets acquired by billionaires, likely for a reason. And that isn't to say that these people are looking to maybe they have an agenda. I'm not sure. I'm not going to speculate on that. But I think it's clear to see that if some of the wealthier people of the world are see that as a competitive advantage, it's probably worth taking note of.
Yeah, I would say it's not just even limited maybe to the acquisitions, but it's also how a lot of people like literally create their power and their influence is by building up some sort of media or information based, whether it's a company, a station, a website, all those things. And I think that really just kind of goes back to the fact that information is power, if that's a good catchphrase. But like many people in the world and many organizations want more power or influence than they currently have. And technology enabled scaled communication is a major way to try and achieve that. And therefore, whether it's Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post or Elon buying Twitter, owning a major media outlet, especially if you already have all the money, then that being able to influence on a very large scale the kind of information that's flowing through that outlet may be appealing to someone who has a lot of money and maybe not as much power as they want, or wanting to build up more of that. I think that it just kind of validates also for us as consumers, the importance of having an intentional and diverse media diet or information diet, so that we're not solely being influenced by whatever the whims of an individual actor or a single kind of company, corporation, entity could be, because they all have their own incentives. They all have whatever they're trying to create or attain. And it's useful to be aware of that so that you're able to make your own informed decisions as opposed to just being subject to the whims of others.
What do you personally think of the rise of individuals distributing news or kind of wide scale narratives? Several of these examples are big major media news outlets, but we also have individuals who have very large sway over things. You find a Joe Rogan fan and they're ready to fight for him more quickly than they'd be to fight for this country, probably. And there are people who literally just read the news that people attune to and they really like their take on it. And do you think that there is a coming shift from trust of large organizations to individuals?
Yeah, I think what you just said like highlights a trend that feels like it's been happening for a long time. I don't know if I would only put it as starting really even in the last century, but this kind of there's a democratizing effect of greater access to technology for people to be able to certainly share their own thoughts or publish their own kind of content in the modern age, if you will, but also an increasing ability for anyone else to find it, access it, engage with it. And I think, hey, back in the 50s and 60s, the US only really had three main TV networks, and they were all like pretty tightly controlled compared to TV networks today. And so that had more of a homogenizing effect, I think, on culture and on the information that people choose. And now with the advent, not just of, say, the internet, but even before then, with the pop-up of many TV stations or radio stations or newsletters, you could walk us all the way back to the era of the printing press, which the Catholic Church really tried to keep a close hold on, because being able to replicate and disseminate information is a potential threat to the organizations that currently hold power, whether it's religious, political, social, whatever you want to call it. And today, in our increasingly fragmented and niche capable media ecosystem, whether it's Twitter or blogs or podcasts, apps, I think that there's an increased potential as well as an increased social thirst or demand for feeling like there's a relationship with the creator or the broadcaster, whether it is, in your example, Joe Rogan, or I'm sure your listeners, or really reporters and stuff that are able to like, wait a minute, I can be a really well-known reporter and I can go make way, way more money and be way more influential on my own with my own newsletter and a Substack than I could working at the New York Times or the Washington Post. And I think that technology is like enabling some of those changes, but the principles of how technology interacts with our desire as humans and as consumers of information remain fairly consistent. It's just like where the technology is changing quickest and allowing people to access or create things in ways that they maybe weren't as easily able to do before.
That's very well put. In my head, I consider, man, I wonder if on a long enough time horizon, we just have all of these like really hyper influential individuals, but at the same time, how different does that actually look than where we currently are? Of just it's under a brand rather than the person's name, and they're probably innately of themselves is not that much different, but it's just I don't know. Maybe you're quicker to fall under your own individual name than a company name.
Right? Celebrities and enthusiasm for celebrities or politicians or royalty isn't necessarily a new thing, but I think maybe some of the like tech enablement of our natural human desire for a tribal identity, for feeling like you belong to something is just it's adapting with the technology and with the changing motions of society and the environments that we're in.
I want to get into your background. When I first came across your LinkedIn profile, I immediately wanted to share it with every veteran that I have ever seen and ever talked to because of the fact that not only is it you've worked at some really great places, but one of the most tactful resumes that I've seen because everything that you spoke to on your resume is very just, I was responsible for this. It increased this value by this much, and then here was the result. Did somebody coach you to that? Was that something that you just innately thought? I'm gonna have to like include this in a link, show people this because this was something that immediately stuck out about looking at your social profile.
No, I appreciate it. It is not something that I innately appreciated. And I've had like many mentors, peers, and coaches help guide me towards making it punchy and useful, especially in the private sector, in a way that it wasn't. Like, I'm sure the Navy and the other branches are similar to this, but like the language used on officer evaluations or NCO evaluations is very different because the military prioritizes different things and doesn't have the same profit motive that basically any private sector organization is going to care about. What matters is, did you get this training done? Did you fire all the bullets, or did you do everything safely? And what were you responsible for? As opposed to the language of the private sector, which is, hey, did you make number go up? Did you make bad number go down? And what action did you as an individual actually do that led to that? And so I look back at the resume that I had when I was like applying to grad schools and stuff, and it's been a very long walk to get here with a lot of work, but I've benefited from a lot of coaching and advice from people who've been doing this a little bit longer than me, which has really helped me out and get it to a, I think, reasonably useful place.
You told me one on one that you really struggled in some of those early tech interviews that you had as you've gone through this. And I want to talk about that and then talk about what difference it made once you actually landed the first job. What was that unlock of getting that first job? What landed you there?
Yeah, I told you previously when I came into business school with this hypothesis of, okay, I want to go work in tech. I think because I'm coming from the PSYOP world that I want to do marketing within tech. That seems like the most like direct translation. And that's like that's a pretty common thing. When you go to TAP as a transitioning service member, they're like, hey, what did you do in the military? What's the closest thing to that in the private sector? Because that's probably what you can get hired for. That's like a fine direct line, but it's not the right thing for everyone. And I think the other kind of like dynamic there were a couple of things that I did not adequately appreciate that I like failed to understand and learn about before I was out there trying to get interviews at tech companies. And the first was that like the game of company hiring at a company is different from the game of getting into grad school. When you're trying to get into any sort of, or really any sort of like higher education program, whether undergrad or grad school, you're probably being considered you're competing with a cohort of like other veterans because any program is really trying to construct a total class that is adequately diverse with a nice well-rounded group of people that will be able to learn from each other. And so like any business school is, yeah, we want to be like somewhere 5% veterans. And so then it's really, hey, you're competing with other people that have functionally identical backgrounds to you. Yeah, one guy might be a pilot, one guy might be infantry, one guy might be like a SWO or a submariner, but at the end of the day, you're still like trying to stand out from other veterans. And then I didn't understand this adequately, how different like tech hiring was going to be even from MBA applications, which is different from like consulting hiring or banking hiring. So I could have done a much better job of learning about that. And when I was in my first year of grad school, I was trying to apply, or I was applying to all the tech companies under the sun, hoping to get an interview and kind of counting on a military resume and a grad student resume to get me in the door there. And it was just crickets, man. Most of the time, I couldn't even get like a decline response. It was just you fired off your cover letter and your resume and it just went into a black hole. And
that they really don't want you when they don't even give you the decline email.
The funny thing was there were some roles that I applied to my first year that I got rejections to a year later. And I was like, dude, this was a summer internship. Like, why are you sending this later? Anyway, there were lots of things that I could have done better to learn. But luckily, as I was getting later into my first year of grad school, I was like, man, none of this is working. I need to get back to the drawing board. And then started to ask some of the better questions. And really luckily, one of my good buddies from my time as a PSYOP officer had another friend who had gotten off active duty recently and gone through the break line program, which basically isn't like higher education, but it's a speed run of preparing veterans and other like underrepresented minorities for hiring in the tech world, started by one of the former like deans of Stanford's business school. And so this dude was at Facebook, no higher degree, nothing else, but had gotten into a very good job there. I ended up going and grabbing breakfast with him when I was in California, had a really good rapport and learned about what he was doing at Facebook. And I was just like, holy shit, I didn't even know that existed, but that's what I want to do. That sounds awesome. And talked with this dude. He basically just gave me a warm handoff to a recruiter who was hiring for an internship role. And that warm handoff at least got me a call with the recruiter. And by then I was like so scared about not finding a job that I was like, I need to like read the books, find the blogs, figure out how to play this game. And luckily, all of the interviews that I had gotten but completely fallen on my face in had allowed me to learn quickly enough that I was like pretty well prepared for that one. Got this internship at Facebook, went there for 3 months during my summer in between years of grad school, learned a lot, enjoyed it, got a return offer for a full-time job after graduating. And it was amazing. Then going back to apply to more tech jobs, my second year in grad school, I still wanted to go and try to do more interviews, get more reps under my belt. And it made a world of difference. Like literally, I was the same person, but the only thing that was different was on the top of my resume, it now said Facebook product intern. And all of a sudden, most companies were at least jumping on a call with me and they were getting back to me quickly. And I get it. I was a weird dude who'd spent probably longer than he should have in the Army, 9 years on active duty, and then was like trying to come into jobs in the tech sector. I didn't have a technical background. I had been history major in undergrad. And then most recruiters are going to look at my resume and be like, oh, this guy did a lot of stuff with guns and people, and now he wants to be a tech nerd. That's not what we need. We have a pile of 100 resumes from actual tech nerds who have engineering backgrounds ready to do this stuff. And luckily I was able to fail fast enough to like still recover and then make this Facebook thing work. And then it really just started to snowball from there. But getting the snowball started was really the tough part.
How critical do you think it was to have your job prospects and like what you were pursuing aligned with what your actual interests were at the time? And still to this day, really.
It was critical. I think when I talk to transitioning vets, I have to say one of the best things that I did was actually take the time, talk to mentors, and talk to a lot of other people who were a couple years ahead of me and understand not just how they did what they did, but why they liked it. So I was able to show up to grad school with a much kind of stronger, or at least like more concrete hypothesis that still changed, but it was at least a hypothesis about what I wanted to go do. Whereas I think a failure mode of a lot of vets that are like, oh, I just got to get into an MBA program or some sort of grad school and then I'll figure it out. And then you show up and you're so far off the power curve because all of a sudden all these options are getting thrown at you. It might be tech, it might be small business, it might be private equity or investment banking or management consulting. And it's choice overload. And you don't know how to decide which thing to pursue, because a lot of us coming out of the military, especially like combat or soft specialties or pilots and stuff, we're like innately wired to just be like, what's the hardest or most prestigious thing? let me go do that and compete for that. And then that'll be like what tells me my worth or lets me get my merit badges and shiny objects to be proud of. But like, the problem is that only goes so far. And a lot of times the things that are prestigious in a certain industry or area are not actually the things that you end up wanting. And I saw a lot of folks be like, oh, I should go do the hardest, most elite thing out of business school because that had worked for them in the military. And then they're like, oh, I hate this thing, whatever it is. And then they end up just having wasted their own time, as well as then they're back to the drawing board months or years later than they might have been by doing that work early. The things that really led my intuition towards tech were partially a quality of life play after a handful of deployments and a ton of time away from my family while I was on active duty. That was what I wanted to do. That was why I went and did it, but I didn't want to keep doing it at the expense of other aspects of my life. And so I wanted to be able to choose where I lived. I wanted like some semblance of work-life balance, and I wanted to work on things that were already like innately interesting and attractive to me. And so for me, that kind of brought me to tech as an industry because, my focus was being on the West Coast where I'm from. I didn't want to work like 80, 100-hour weeks like bankers or consultants. And knowing that about myself was really helpful because then I got to show up to school and just put on blinders and be like, I don't care if Goldman Sachs or McKinsey or BCG or JP Morgan want to do interviews this week. I don't care about that. I'm not going to go do it. And if I want to, I can always like change my hypothesis. But I saw a lot of other vets be like, oh yeah, I need to go do that because that's a cool opportunity. I'm like, yeah, it is a cool opportunity and it might be the right one for you. But some folks haven't done kind of the inner work or the introspection to decide why that might be the right thing for them.
I know that you're also a Veterati mentor, and I've done quite a few calls on the platform as well,
Mhm.
just trying to give back to people that I wish that I had that kind of resource going through that period of time.
Totally.
And that is such a common misstep that I think it's not really quite understood. And that's people get on a call, I'd let them give their spiel, and then the question is, or that the very first thing that I ask him, like, okay, that's all great, but let's first start to talk about what kind of job you actually want to do, because you usually end up in one of two camps. Like you said, you're looking for somebody wants to go and just do the elite thing. It doesn't even matter what it is, or they just want a job. They're getting out because fuck the military or whatever, and they really want to stick it to the man. And so they're
Yeah.
just like, anything is better than this. Not really. There's probably a lot worse jobs. And so you're probably going to go end up in one of those two trains of thought, and spending a couple weeks and just like thinking really innately about what is it that makes me feel good in a workplace? What type of work do I enjoy doing? The environment, and then almost working backwards and saying what exactly meets that criteria. Like your example with the investment banking thing, if you only want to work 40 hours a week, you can eliminate basically anything in finance. Like that makes it real easy for that.
Totally.
And that for some reason that is just not really approached that way. And I think it ought to.
Yeah, I agree. And I realize, guess what? TAP's goal is to get as many people some sort of job as possible, but that is the ultimate lowest common denominator. And I think it's so important for vets to realize, hey, you may have had a great experience in the military, you might have had a terrible one, but now that you are leaving and taking off the uniform, like there is no one other than you to guide where you go. And I think that kind of it sneaks up on a lot of people. It snuck up on me in certain ways where I was just like, oh, the interviews for tech will be pretty similar to MBA stuff. I can figure that out. And had that kind of blow up in my face. And I had to go back to the drawing board. And I think a lot of folks can, yeah, just kind of be like, oh, I'll figure something out. I'll just be happy to be out of the military or whatever. But you're only stealing from your future self if you aren't taking the time to be intentional and try to learn. Like I really enjoy like the mentoring on Veterati. I've also got a younger cousin who's an Air Force officer. And I was like, man, I wish I had been able to like reach back and tell myself a lot of this stuff when I was a lieutenant or like a junior captain to just be better prepared and have to do less hard learning for myself because there's so many people out out there, especially vets in the who are maybe a little bit older than us or in the private sector, who are happy to take some time and talk to people, share their lessons learned, and help be a sounding board and give you feedback on what you don't know, or what you might need to think about before you go racing off to chase the next shiny object or the next merit badge.
A lot of people harp on the value of your network, and I don't think that people need another reason why it's the greatest thing ever. But in that example, where you knew somebody who ended up just getting you the job, and you don't even really need to know somebody, you can literally type in, "Hey, I want to go work at this place," type in that place, and then veteran, and it's going to give you a list of all of these people who are former service that probably would get on a call with you.
Totally.
It
I'd say like my hit rate on like cold messages on LinkedIn, at least for a response, is like probably like north of 80% if it's someone with any military connection, because I've benefited immensely from the help of like other people who have been doing any number of things in the private sector, in academia, and it feels really good to give back. And yeah, it's just, yeah, it makes such a difference to be able to do that. And when you find that kind of like common, hey, we've got service in our background, as long as you're not a complete chucklehead, most folks will say yes to at least a short call. And then it's really on you to ask the right questions, show up prepared, do the research, and then really keep momentum off of the learnings that you can get from these other people. Because the best thing you can do is try to learn from other people's mistakes instead of only through your own.
What do you think about how we ought to continue to narrow our job search over time? At the beginning, you are in the spot where you like want to take anybody who will hire me is like a good thing. And that's not the best way to go about it. Sometimes you have to make some concessions early on if
Mhm.
that's really your only option. And especially if you've got people relying on you for income. But one of the things that is evident by your background is your ability to say no to things over time if they don't meet your criteria. It's not just about more money, there are other qualitative factors you can optimize for. How has that played out in your job search since landing that first gig at Facebook?
Yeah, I think that yeah, it is hugely beneficial to buy yourself some buffer or have some kind of like backup plans and have numerous irons in the fire, so you're not solely wedded to just one option. And if that blows up, then all of a sudden you don't know what's next. You don't have contingency plans or anything like that. I was considering like non-tech jobs for my internship if the Facebook thing hadn't worked out. Doing something's better than nothing, and just because it doesn't work out the first time doesn't mean you like can't come back. I had plenty of friends, peers, other vets who like went and did, some of these like high-end professional services stuff, whether banking or consulting or even like legal things, who after some time were like, hey, that was great, I don't want to do this anymore, so now I'm going to like work on the next thing. And you can do that as long as you've bought yourself the time. So kind of my most recent example of this being useful, I would go back and say it was very beneficial to me to have taken time in between some of my major career transitions. So like when I left active duty, I had almost 4 months before I started grad school, and I took time off. I traveled, I spent time with family, and getting some decompression, especially when I was like freshly back from a deployment, was really helpful so that I could show up and be fully committed and present when I was at school. And then similarly, like when I finished school, I was like, all right, I want to take as much time off as possible before I start a job. And having a little bit of money saved, and also having that, just having set that intention for myself, was really useful so that I could actually be like, so that I could actually honor that and pursue that with some degree of confidence and not be anxious about, should I be doing what everyone else is doing? Some folks want to still be on terminal leave when they waltz right into their next job. And that's fine if that works for them. But that would not be my advice to most people. The same way of some people want to already be working full time while doing grad school. And for me, I thought it made sense for my first grad degree to go do it full time and really be there and get the benefit out of just bouncing off of all of these other people from different careers and professional backgrounds and walks of life. So I feel like it just really made the most sense to do that. But then not just the time buffer, but of course, like a financial one too. I was not expecting to get laid off last November from Stripe, but hey, woke up one day to the email and most of my team was gone, and me included. And I was like, okay, I'm really glad that I've been living below my means and thinking about whatever my next thing was already. So it wasn't just a complete rug pull moment on my entire life. And so then I was kind of able to say, okay, I've got some time, I've got some money saved up. Like I don't have to spaz out and go try to desperately find any job that'll pay me because that I wouldn't even be that interested in, or give a potential employer all of the power in that negotiation. And took the winter off, tried to spend some time just reconnecting with my hobbies and going wherever my interests took me. And that kind of led me back to the machine learning side of things. And luckily, because I had something of a tech network at this point, I was able to get a warm intro into my now manager at OpenAI. And that really worked out because not only is it a job that I'm like excited about, but it's something that I think will be both, it's adequate financially, but also it's just fantastically intellectually stimulating in a way that a lot of, oh, I'll take any job things won't. And I think you will perform better at a job where your interest is high than at something, even if it's really high paying, if you're only there for the money. And then that kind of gets even harder to justify if it's the money's just good enough, but I actually hate it or I really don't care about it.
Any of those circumstances where you're got a gun to your head about making a decision, you're never going to think clearly when you're not living in a way that is in accordance with how much money you actually make. And then also just even on the job search as well, you want to pursue things that aren't aligned with your interests. Like it's not going to last. Like you're not going to be operating from a position of strength. And I think that what you just said really embodies thinking through what you're actually trying to accomplish and giving yourself time and elbow room to make those decisions, because when you're backed into a corner it gets ugly
Our
with your
brains are not
finances or
wired to
anything.
think like that. When you're in an unexpected panic situation, our lizard brain takes over and it's fight, flee, or freeze. And yeah, you're probably not going to make a good decision that your human brain is going to be thrilled with if you do that. And I'm not saying that you can totally de-risk it, but if you can be intentional and anticipate things that might go sideways on you, then you can at least try to have some fallback positions or build yourself a buffer so that it's not, oh my gosh, like I'm not paying my mortgage if I don't have a job all the time. And that really giving yourself that freedom preemptively was something that I am massively grateful for. And that I had like mentors and friends encourage me to think about that before that happened.
What are some of the tangible things that you are doing now that protects that downside? Let's maybe an example or two on the financial side. I know you live in a very expensive part of the country, and then maybe on the professional side as well, in terms of protecting that career trajectory and not being forced to go somewhere you don't want to.
Yeah, I'll harken back to the generic principle of diversification first, and then maybe also talk about what I feel like is a superpower in terms of being like open minded about things and opportunities. Diversification first, like not being overly exposed to any one risk, certainly a pretty common financial or investment theory, but I think it's also really useful for folks like us, veterans in the transition mindset or in the transition career phase, because it's really easy to like over identify with your job title, with your rank, with your be like, oh, all of my successes are due to me and that self-serving bias, and all of my failures are just due to bad circumstances. And so I think it's really healthy to be diversified, not just in how you're treating your money, but also how you're treating your interests, your professional opportunities, your relationships with friends and family and acquaintances and all of those kinds of things, and trying to make sure that you aren't getting so overweight in one of those areas. And then I think that kind of connects to what I also said about like open-mindedness and maybe even just curiosity and continued exploration. Because if you'd asked me even as a grad student, hey, this is what you might be doing 5 years from now, I'd be like, that's weird and different, but not what I might have expected, but also cool. And like, certainly that sentiment would just increase as you went back into my time in uniform. But I don't know, I'm pretty like pleased with this, working at a company and on stuff that I think is cool, enjoying my life with my partner and having gotten to reconnect with all of my family on the West Coast over the last 5 years. Whereas like, in uniform, I saw them like maybe once a year because op tempo was high and I was living internationally or on the East Coast. And here I live 15 minutes from my sister and her family, and I get to see my nieces at least once a week. That's really nice and special to me. And the open-mindedness for the change, but also just, again, that reflection muscle of being like, hey, what actually matters to me? And trying to be conscientious and aware of what maybe we're perceiving is expected from us, either by others or by our company or our community, church, whatever. And then being like, okay, these are the things that actually matter to me, and these are the things that don't. And then being willing to be intentional around actually honoring those things and prioritizing them and deprioritizing the stuff that just isn't as meaningful or important to you, regardless of what matters to other folks.
It's so difficult to give concrete advice on this because it's so personal. It's
Yeah.
very hyper personal, and you need people to be hungry and driven towards one direction. Like once on the left hand, we've got, oh, you just need to figure out what you want and then go for. But
Hmm.
you also need to be like flexible if something else comes up because
Right.
it doesn't necessarily, it may not manifest itself in the way that you think it is.
Yeah.
And finding that balance is so challenging. And as somebody who is, I'm the type of person that is constantly wanting other people's input. What do you think about this? And trying to get all of the information to make an informed decision. It just is, it's a dead end, to be honest, because there's infinite opinions about things and it ends up just being a 50-50. There's actually no real clear way.
Everyone's going to have a hot take or going to have thoughts about what you did or what you didn't do or how you did it. But like at the end of the day, this is easier said than done. But what really matters is how you and the people you love feel about those choices. It's an easy refrain to be like, hey, no one lies on their deathbed wishing they'd spent more time at the office. But as easy as that trope is, okay, what are we doing about that now? How are we like living with purpose and intention and prioritizing the things that you can't get back or the things that you can't fix after the fact? It's easy to chase and it's easy to quantify money or title or whatever. And I'm not saying these things are mutually exclusive, but I think it's really valuable to cultivate whatever practice is worthwhile for you as an individual. Maybe it's meditation or mindfulness or yoga or journaling or being in a community group of some sort or just family time. But like finding the way that finding however works for you to stay aligned with what matters and your values and priorities is really helpful. I'm not an avid journaler, but I do like to sit down around like once a month or maybe once every 2 months at the longest and sit down and do my own little look back. Like, hey, when was I feeling best? When was I operating best in the last month or two? When wasn't I? What can I learn from that to try to double down on? And what do I need to try to throttle back on or detach myself from or delegate or find some way to not just keep making the same mistakes? And I find that to be really helpful. And I didn't really start doing that until I was in grad school and trying to kind of make sure that I wasn't like stepping on landmines as I ventured into the civilian world and trying to figure all this shit out for myself.
Think that journaling or at least consciously thinking about it is a really good first step. And it's very hard to do. I am in the same boat. I
Yeah,
should do it more because our frame of mind as we experience things is much different than it is in the future looking back on things. Like the benefit of hindsight opens up a lot, and day to day you're not really acting in a way, or at least I know that I'm not, and I'm not like just every moment of every day thinking like, is this furthering my mission? And it's easy to spend months sometimes and you look back and you're like, what the hell have I been doing? Like, why
right.
have I not made any progress on this thing? And it's because you're not having those kind of regular check-ins and holding yourself accountable to reaching your own goals.
Totally. One of my favorite kind of podcasters, writers, Scott Galloway, has a saying like it's hard to read the label from inside the bottle. And that's where I think like journaling can be a good way to, I don't know, once I start letting the pen go every once in a while, like you'll be amazed, like, oh wow, I am feeling that way. And I hadn't even consciously been aware of it. Or talking about it with a partner, a friend, a therapist, anything like that, I think can really help let those things bubble up from your subconscious that otherwise it's really easy to just put your head down and be like, no, I just need to keep working harder or whatever. But letting that truth come out from wherever the source is really valuable, because then I can look back in my journal and be like, I was annoyed about this thing 6 months ago or 12 months ago. It's still happening. Like I need to do something different. Trying harder isn't the way, or doing whatever I've tried to do so far needs to change. Otherwise, I'm not going to get any different results.
I want to close out with one more topic here and talk about your role at OpenAI. Now you're landed a job in product policy around safety and trust. I would be, after this big conversation about information, the power of it, we have to talk about it. You're a month or so in. What did ending up at this job mean to you? And that's a very take that any direction you want, but what has that meant to you and what are you looking to achieve by working there?
Yeah, I think part of it is just the next step for me of continuing to follow what is interesting to me and what feels like a good learning opportunity. And I got this advice from a lot of like mentors and professors in grad school when I was considering like different job offers. Good problem to have, but me as a newly transitioned veteran, I was like, I don't think I can like turn down more money, right? I just spent 10 almost 10 years in the service making officer pay not bad, but not the most money out there, especially when you're starting to look at private sector stuff. And luckily, some of my like professors were like, hey, as much as you can, try to put on blinders to like the comp right now, because it gets real easy to just only chase the number and not actually think about whether or not you care about the work, whether it's interesting to you. And it's much harder to quantify the learning value of the work you'll be doing, the place you'll be doing it, and the people you'll be doing it with. And I think that was really valuable to me because it allowed me to take a lower paying job offer to go do work that I cared about at Facebook. And then I made a similar decision when I went over to Stripe. And then just also again like honoring the interest. I realized that like last year, as more generative AI tools and ML stuff started like really gaining kind of traction or interest, I was just like, I am spending my own money and hours of my nights like doing this with my spare time outside of my day job. Maybe I should look at this as a potential next step. And the trust and safety thing, I think, is like really it'll probably resonate, or at least it does resonate with some of the veterans. There's more veterans, I think, that end up in the space because it still aligns with that sense of purpose that drew a lot of us to the uniform in the first place. Being like, hey, I care about others. I want to protect them. I want to help make things better for them. And there's an aspect of that of, yes, there are tech tools can be very powerful, but at the same time, in the hands of bad actors, they can really amplify their ability to do bad things. And so then you need people who care and parts of the companies who are like, hey, we have to consider this, even if it's not an obvious like financial metric of profit go up or profit go down, and try to figure out how to protect the users or the tools from being used for bad purposes. And so that was really the appeal to me of coming over here and working on this, because it's not just, hey, how do we put stuff say on the website that is, yes, you can use it for this, you can't use it for that, but then also being like, okay, how do we actually implement that? How do we build an organization and kind of actual rules and guidelines that allow us to try to do that as fast as possible while still innovating, while still developing and trying to balance the trade-offs of technology, and especially new technology as it gets launched out into the world and used by humanity for all sorts of things.
I would be curious to rewind the clock and have a conversation with anybody at the time of like when the internet was coming out or even any kind of step change like technology like I would consider these adaptation of large language models is to some extent and hear some of the feedback and worries because certainly not in my lifetime I don't think that there has been a worry of this magnitude of just the world ending, the robots, whatever conspiracy theory you want to talk about, people are really hearkening to on what this means for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. As a history nerd, I think it's really fascinating to think about, okay, if there are not just serious economic, but societal level impacts that could be unlocked through whether it's LLMs or just AI tools more generally, it's very important to learn from the mistakes of previous waves of tech innovation. And even outside of just the tech world, whether you want to talk about the move to mobile or before that, the internet, and even just like microprocessors, all of them were like step changes that some things went well and some didn't. And even walk it back to say like nuclear technology or space technology, there are a lot of very complex systems that sometimes things go wrong with. And so trying to think about how we make them as safe as possible and as beneficial as possible is really appealing to me. And that was when I was going through the interview process with OpenAI and other employers. I think I was even more resolute about trying to find a place that I felt like cared about that kind of stuff than even like previous like career moves that I'd made. I You want to find somewhere where you align with the work, and there's a lot of learning to do. And so I feel the kind of function that I'm in now and the company that I'm doing it at allows me to bring in some of my weird like tech and science nerd tendencies and leverage them to have really interesting discussions with intelligent people about, okay, what should we do about this? All right, what does that mean for what happens next week? And getting to like tap into some of that risk management brain that I think the military often like either rewards or wires into us, because it's like, hey, guess what? No battle plan survives first contact with the internet or with the enemy. You're gonna have to think about what you do next and have contingencies and be prepared for alternatives. And that kind of intuition is really useful here for where you're trying to like de-risk how the best and worst aspects of human nature might interact with the technology.
As you go into this, what are your personal biggest fears? And how are you thinking about it and things that you're bringing to the conversation around the safety and trust of this technology and product? What's at the top of your mind?
Oh, that's a good question. And something we talk about a lot. Like even before I started work, I like went in to grab lunch with my future teammates. And that was like one of the questions within 5 minutes of sitting down to lunch was like, what do you think is like the biggest threat of this technology, or the most concerning thing? I think if I had to try to zoom out to maybe like the technology level thing, I think that there is something that gives me pause, I would say, is like the kind of dynamic of competition and perverse incentives leading to not prioritizing safety decisions or not adequately considering them. I think you can see both with complex systems, there's a lot of precedent from aviation and space technology of, hey, we're trying to get up into orbit first, or we're trying to fire a bigger rocket first. Blowing up on the launch pad is bad when it happens in a test. It's really bad when it happens and humans are involved. But those are still like somewhat limited to the people who are involved with the thing. Where, here now with like technological reliance and penetration across society, I think you're talking about like potential orders of magnitude. That is why a lot of people revert to thinking about nuclear weapons and nuclear technology proliferation for what do we learn here? I think you see it a lot with the discussions of regulation. And so I guess I'm hopeful that we learn from previous waves of technology and can not make the same mistakes again this time, and be both like more proactive in what we develop and how we release it than what I think sometimes the challenge of tech innovators is, we'll build the technology and we'll fire it out and see what happens and we'll learn later. But sometimes it warrants being prudent. And I hope that this is one of those times, not just for any one company, but also for the industry and for society.
I spend a lot of my free time on the edge of this corner of the world as well, and find myself often asked by family members and friends, "Oh, what do you think about this?" And a lot of the common retort is, "What about the dangers of this and these AI spoofing calls and stuff like that?" And I'm like, "You got to think about this. We are in an arms race, a different type of arms race against a lot of other people, and if we aren't gonna do it, then somebody else will, and people probably already have to some extent." One of the things that I reference regularly that I really appreciate about Elon Musk is with SpaceX, and what he's doing there is he went back to first principles, and even with Tesla, in a lot of ways, it's, hey, this is the way that things have been done in the past. Let's get back to first principles of like physics. And I think OpenAI is doing something similar of what is the baseline technology say that is possible with this, and then how do we iterate in a way that is not the way that we've just been continuing to forward adding something just slightly new each model of F-150. It's a complete redesign of how we look at and apply technology, and I think it's a requirement. We have to do it, and that innovation is what drives our country's dominance. That's what pushes the world forward. And I hate to think about a world where we stop doing that.
Mhm. Yeah, I think whether it's an individual trying to like learn something new or develop a new skill, or a company or a university or a country trying to develop some new capability, there is some merit to the saying like what got you here won't get you there. And a lot of times, especially in the technology world, innovation comes from weird or different places, or not just doing the thing the way we've always done it, because you start to you will often like veer into just diminishing marginal returns, and then some new technology is invented or comes out of left field that unlocks something and lets you just keep pushing along. People have been talking about like Moore's law running out for a very long time, and it's defied a lot of expectations in that field, but it's hard to say until someone creates what the next level of the technology is, where that step where where the next step change comes from.
One of the things that I thought was really interesting on OpenAI's website, in their charter, they talk about safety. And this is something that I actually hadn't read until the last couple days. I had put out a thing on Twitter asking if anybody had any interesting questions for you. They were all largely very uninformed and not intelligent, but I thought that this particular line from the OpenAI charter was interesting. We are concerned about late stage AGI development becoming a competitive race without time for adequate safety precautions. Therefore, if a value aligned, safety conscious project comes close to building AGI before we do, we commit to stop competing with and start assisting this project.
I think that, and a lot of the other things that I think OpenAI and other responsible companies are saying, these principles or these values are going to guide the work that we do, is encouraging. I don't want to be like overly optimistic or say that it's going to, hey, everything's going to be fine because they said this, but it gives me some hope that we won't necessarily repeat some of the similar kind of shortcomings of Web 1.0, social media, mobile stuff. And was, again, like part of the reason I felt drawn not just to work on, say, AI or ML in general, but also like specifically here. And it was fun, like even just getting started at the company, a lot of people being like, man, we're excited that, that you're here because we all care about this. And it's not like, at some tech companies, there is a dynamic where people in trust and safety are either, it's like being like a second class citizen, or it's, hey, you do the best you can with what you have, but you're never going to stop everything, and it's not the priority because this doesn't make money for the business. And the selection that you just read, I think, is one of the things that's okay. This could be a place where I feel like we'll make a hard decision, even if it's not typically how like certain other companies might be expected to act.
Yeah, I agree. When I read that, I was like, man, this is really interesting. You're not going to read this on some Fortune 500 company's website about, and most companies aren't doing these types of things. And so if you want to be different, you got to act different. And
Yeah.
yeah, I would encourage, if you're listening to this and you're interested in this subject, I would highly encourage reading the OpenAI charter because they detail a lot of this specifically. Troy, this has been a really fun conversation. I've enjoyed talking and getting to know you. What is one thing that every veteran ought to stop what they're doing and do for themselves right now?
I don't know if I would like necessarily say it's like, hey, one thing to do for themselves, as much as I think something that mentors have encouraged me to do and that I like to try and propagate out. But finding ways to incorporate and practice gratitude and presence in your daily life, I think it's not just beneficial to stop thinking about the next thing or racing towards whatever's coming next, or thinking about the future or dwelling on the past, but I think gratitude and presence really help us also honor the sacrifices of people that we've worked with, the people who were killed or wounded in the wars that we've been a part of, and really everyone who's come before us in the country or in society to give us the pretty awesome world that we now get to wander through. And so I'd say part one is practice, find your way to practice the gratitude and preference. Yeah. Presence, and then also be willing to ask for help and do something for others. It doesn't just pay off for them, but it feels really good when you know that you've helped someone. And often I think is like one of the things that we find as veterans who've transitioned into the private sector is sometimes missing from the kind of psychic value of work that we do. Yeah, even we might be making money or providing for our families, but it feels good to be part of something that's bigger and more meaningful than yourself, and is something that isn't always as easy to find. And whether that's calling someone, a family or a family member, friend from your service, or someone here in your wherever your local community is, helping lift them up, share some gratitude for something they've done for you. I think those are the things that have helped me find the high points that I've been able to find in my life, but also helped me endure some of the low points and the challenges and the obstacles that I've bumped into along the way, and keep those relationships strong. And yeah, just to be grateful for them where they are.
I saw a quote online. Memorial Day is just a couple weeks past, and somebody said, "Live a life worth dying for."
Yes.
And man, what a day to think about the amount of lives that have been sacrificed for us to be here. So, a lot to be thankful for, and best not to waste it.
Yeah. Work's not finished.
Absolutely. What can myself and or the listeners do to be useful to you?
I think in the macro sense, I'd say live good lives, be good citizens, try to be a better person, and don't beat yourself up too much. It's easy to like dwell on all the bad stuff, but overall, we're often in pretty good places, and we'll enjoy our lives and be better people and citizens if we appreciate that.
You heard the man. Go do it. Be thankful and act accordingly. Troy, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks, Brock. Great talking with you.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. Your listenership helps me better educate people like you and the rest of our nation's military, both past and present, on building a successful life outside of military service. If you're looking for more ways the top vets are leading more effective lifestyles, building businesses, and using the resources designed specifically for you, press here for a selection of some of the best clips. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date, and I will be talking with you soon.